By the time I got to the emergency room, my ejection fracture had gone down to 22, which, I was in heart failure.
Wow.
Bad. By the next morning, as they were sending me in to get an MRI done and about to go in for a heart cath, my ejection fracture was down to 12. So I was
I
was nosediving and sort of at the 1 yard line of, where you need to be.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer, and this is your number one source for learning about the unique medical side of the world of sports. Pro wrestler Triple H had a very candid conversation with Stephen A. Smith on his show, Stephen A's World, about what happened with his recent health scare. And we're going to break down exactly what he was talking about and learn some more from this conversation in this video.
I was in Florida when towards the end of that, I started feeling really run down. I thought I had some COVID, which, I had before. I was vaccinated twice and had a run of COVID without symptoms, but I was beginning to think that I was having shortness of breath and, everything else. I went and got tested for COVID. I didn't have it, but I had a viral pneumonia.
Shortness of breath is a symptom that can come from a number of different things, where essentially you feel like your body is not able to actually take in enough oxygen. To get oxygen to your tissues, you have to first breathe in air into your lungs. That oxygen then has to diffuse from the lungs into the blood, and then the heart has to deliver that blood out to the tissue. So one of the first things we think about when somebody has shortness of breath is whether or not this is coming from the pulmonary system, like the lungs, not being able to exchange enough air into the blood, or potentially a problem with the heart being able to take that oxygenated blood and pump it out to the rest of the body. In this case, Triple H was first diagnosed with a viral pneumonia. Of course, pneumonia is an infection within the lungs, and it can be caused by anything from a virus to a bacteria to even something like a fungal infection. Air first gets into our lungs by going through the trachea. It then kind of spreads out into this architecture that sort of looks like a tree branch, where the airways get smaller and smaller until you ultimately get to the very end, where we have these structures called alveoli. With a pneumonia, the infection causes inflammation, causes damage to these airways, which impairs your body's ability to take that oxygen and get it into the bloodstream. This is what these little alveoli, these little air sacs look like, and we have tons and tons of these throughout our lungs to be that last layer of air exchange. Whenever we have pneumonia, we get all this inflammation, this fluid, this kind of pus-like material that accumulates in those alveoli, which impair gas exchange to prevent that oxygen from getting into the bloodstream. Pneumonia in and of itself can be deadly, but with Triple H, things became even more serious.
My lungs were inflamed, and as the next couple of days went on, when I got home, it got increasingly worse, and my wife saw some blood and stuff that I was coughing up.
Blood in the sputum can be a sign of damage to the airways, where the actual capillaries, the blood vessels around the airways are tearing, and there's blood accumulating inside that secretion that comes up when you cough. But also sometimes people who have heart failure will have this kind of pink, frothy secretions as well. So that red color can be coming from a number of different things. But basically, when somebody is getting progressively worse, despite what you think is adequate treatment, you have to start looking at other systems to see if something else is potentially causing the shortness of breath.
And went and got checked, and it was coming from the viral pneumonia, but I had fluid in my lungs. I had some fluid around my heart.
Fluid around the lungs is something we call pulmonary edema. So edema means swelling or fluid. And then fluid around the heart is something we call a pericardial effusion. Now, things here can overlap a little bit, because as we'll get to, ultimately it was discovered that Triple H had heart failure, and heart failure can lead to pulmonary edema. Essentially, as we'll discuss with heart failure, your heart is not able to pump the blood from the heart out to the rest of the body. And so you get this stagnant back pressure that causes pressure in the blood vessels to build up inside the lungs. And that pressure causes fluid to leak into the airways. And so now, instead of that inflammation, that pus in the airway, you actually get like fluid that accumulates within those airways, causing that pulmonary edema. And again, in this case, this can be coming from not only things like pneumonia, but also from heart failure if the heart can't adequately pump blood throughout this whole circulatory system.
So they followed up on it, did an EKG and echo and everything.
An EKG and an echo are two of the fundamental ways that we assess both the electrical activity and function of the heart, and then the structural function of the heart. An echocardiogram is an ultrasound of the heart, where we can actually capture how well the heart is beating, and we can see in enough detail the actual individual valves within the heart. We can measure how much those chambers are contracting, and we can estimate this ejection fraction, which Triple H will talk about in a minute here, which is basically a function of how well the heart is squeezing blood. An EKG, on the other hand, is to evaluate the electrical activity of the heart. Essentially, all of these little sharp spikes and waves that we see here correspond to a different section of the heart, having electricity conducted through it to allow the heart to beat in synchronicity. Depending on what's going on in the heart, with things like a heart attack, with an arrhythmia, things like atrial fibrillation, we see abnormalities with how that electrical system is conducting. And so an EKG is one of the ways that we look for signs of a heart attack, because as that heart muscle dies, we'll see different changes in the EKG that give us clues about that health of the heart muscle.
Basically, the way your heart pumps out, 55 to 60% of your ejection fracture is a good number. I was at 30.
So this was the point at which they knew Triple H was in heart failure. The beating of our heart is synchronized such that blood can first enter into the right side of the heart, be squeezed out into the lungs to get oxygen, come back to the left side of the heart, and then be squeezed to the rest of the body. But as you can see, there's differences here in terms of when each of those chambers contracts, because you have to allow blood to fill into that chamber before you ultimately squeeze it out. The measure of how well the heart is squeezing to circulate that blood is something we call the ejection fraction. With the heart, blood is first coming into the right side through the vena cava. Goes into the right atrium, is pumped into the right ventricle, and then from the right ventricle, it goes out to the lungs to get oxygen. Travels through those little alveoli like we looked at earlier to allow oxygen to diffuse in and carbon dioxide to diffuse out. Blood then with oxygen comes back to the left side of the heart, into the left ventricle, and then pumped out to the body. Essentially, the difference between how much blood is squeezed out of the heart with each beat compared to how much was in there when that squeeze started is what we call the ejection fraction. And as Triple H is saying, we typically see that kind of 50 to 60% range, and the lower it gets, that's suggestive of heart failure.
That was just kind of following this medical stuff up the line of didn't like the way my lungs were inflamed, even though I had pneumonia, was kind of something more going on here.
That's that important part we talked about. When people are getting worse, you have to sort of reconsider your differential. You have to think about if there's other things going on. So it's great that in this case, they thought something else has to be severe here. And sure enough, that's when they discovered the heart failure, which is going to be a much more serious thing probably than his pneumonia was.
So by the time I got to the emergency room, my ejection fracture had gone down to 22, which...
So he's having very rapid decrease in his ejection fraction. So this sounds like it's acute, sort of rapid onset heart failure. Some people will get progressive heart failure where their ejection fraction and cardiac function gradually decreases over time, or you can have it happen very acutely. When it happens acutely, the goal of the doctors is to, first of all, provide support to the heart to allow it to function better, but then also try to discover what in the world is making that heart function go downhill.
I was in heart failure.
Wow.
Bad. By the next morning, as they figured that out that evening, by the next morning, as they were sending me in to get an MRI done and about to go in for a heart cath, my ejection fracture was down to 12.
So this is getting absolutely critical now for Triple H. This is like true emergency, all hands on deck. We've got to figure out what's going on, because the more that ejection fraction is dropping, you're not pumping oxygenated blood out to the body. Basically, almost just like a tenth of the blood that gets into the heart is actually being pushed out to the rest of the vital tissues like the brain. So now there's even more urgency to figure out what's going on before the heart can ultimately completely shut down, and this could be fatal.
When they got inside, I basically genetically had a 99% blockage in my left anterior descending artery, which is what they call the widowmaker.
So now the doctors find out what's driving that heart failure, a coronary blockage that's causing damage to the heart tissue, preventing it from pumping adequately. Just like any other muscle in the body, the heart needs oxygen, it needs blood supply, and it gets that via the coronary arteries. What we'll do here is we'll get rid of the coronary veins, we'll hide some of the initial kind of blood vessels coming off here, and what we'll see if we look kind of top down onto the heart is, number one, this is going to be the aortic valve. It's the valve between the left ventricle and the aorta. What you can see coming off of that aortic valve region are two main coronary arteries. First, we have the left coronary artery, which comes off to supply blood to primarily the left side of the heart. And then we have the right coronary artery, which comes off on the other side to supply the right side of the heart. Off of the left coronary artery are two main branches, the LAD, or the left anterior descending, that kind of comes more down the front of the heart, and then the left circumflex, which kind of wraps around the back. Now, there's a lot of other kind of penetrating vessels that come off of these, but those are kind of the two main ones. And what Triple H is saying is they found basically a complete blockage of that artery. When that artery becomes blocked, you don't get blood supply to the heart tissue, and then that heart muscle tissue starts to die. This is a heart attack. This is a myocardial infarction, or basically death of the heart tissue. And what that myocardial infarction can do is obviously impair the contractile properties and capability of the heart. And so you lose that capability to pump blood, leading to a low ejection fraction and the subsequent heart failure. The goal with treating this is to either go in and try to put a stent or expand to remove that blockage, or in some cases they have to actually go in and do a bypass where they basically make a new blood vessel that bypasses or goes around that blockage to deliver blood down to the rest of the vessel that looks still to be open.
Well, for me, as far as in-ring, which I get a lot, I'm done.
You'll never fight.
I won't, no, I would never wrestle again. First of all, I have a defibrillator in my chest, which, probably not a good idea for me to get zapped on live TV.
How
Right?
about
The last part of this, Triple H, of course, announces he's done wrestling and that he had an implanted cardiac defibrillator basically put into his chest. Whenever somebody has a heart attack, the sequence of events that ultimately cause death is some sort of ventricular arrhythmia. It's an abnormal electrical activity of the heart that prevents the heart from adequately pumping and squeezing. And so that's why whenever we hear somebody down with a heart attack, you go and you get the AED, you get that defibrillator to put those pads on the chest to shock the person's heart to try to restore that electrical rhythm. In some cases, a defibrillator can actually be implanted underneath the skin in the person's body that can automatically detect whenever somebody is in one of those deadly arrhythmias and provide an internal shock to hopefully restart the heart. We saw an example of this with Christian Eriksen, and of course that's a sport, soccer, where you don't have as much high risk of contact. Of course, with wrestling, you don't want to be thrown onto a mat and then break this defibrillator that's inside your chest and then have a whole other host of issues. So athletes in some situations can certainly go back to their sport if they have a defibrillator in place, but it really, really depends on the exact risks of the sport and other things that are going on. Triple H wasn't exaggerating things here. This truly did sound like a touch and go, life-threatening situation because of how low his ejection fraction was and how bad his heart failure was that acutely. It's great to see that he's recovered, and I appreciate him being so candid to share this story with the rest of us so that we can learn something from it to hopefully help others in the future. That's it for the video, everybody. Let me know as always any questions or comments down below. And until next time, we'll see you later. Bye.